and welcome to episode 159 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley, California.
And this is Jon Denning in Los Angeles, I guess, California.
Because there's another Napa Valley somewhere.
I was going to say, who needs to elaborate? But sure.
I felt like it.
You started it. Which may set the tone for this entire conversation, because I think you and I are both feeling a bit loopy, sleep deprived. Just me?
I think it's mostly you. But that's okay. It is late on a Monday evening. This will come out on Tuesday, but we've been working on this test for a while. So anyway, if it's this late, John, you got to be drinking something. What is it?
Right into it, huh? What I needed most was caffeine. What I needed next most was bourbon. And I found a way to get both. I've got, and this is just a college throwback, a Maker's Mark and Diet Coke.
You were drinking Makers in college? Is that your claim?
Yeah, actually, I was. I'm very fancy, David. And mostly I'm trying to watch these hips, so Diet Coke.
You're something.
That's fair. Well, okay. Let's switch the subject. What do you got?
I've got something I have only had one time before, but I had it at a friend's house a couple weeks ago. I never heard of this drink. It's called a Paper Plane. And it does have bourbon in it, which, as you know, for me, is not my number one choice.
No,
but it's also got Aperol and lemon juice and this stuff called Amaro no Nino. And I liked it, so thought I'd go for it again.
Wow.
That's what we're having.
Paper Plane, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is a known drink, apparently. I'd never heard of it, but I mentioned it to a friend of mine, and they were aware of what it was. So I was like, I somehow missed out on this.
I feel like I've heard of it too. Maybe like a Mad Men rerun or something with the normal stuff you do, which is weird.
Well, I can tell you what's not very Mad Men, John.
What's that?
And that's the song for tonight.
Fair enough. I thought we were going to linger on the surprising fact that I went to college. Let's talk about this song, because this might be the most like alley-oop we've ever had. This is pretty much a gimme, right?
Yeah, we've had some others that have been fairly similar, but
the beer games and stuff that we've seen in the past, but this one was just kind of a no-brainer.
Yes, the song, in case anybody's wondering, is Rakim's Follow the Leader.
Yeah.
And for some of you, that'll be like, why is that so obvious? And for another subset of you, it'll be like, oh yeah, because it was the topic of one of the reading comprehension passages that was in fact scored over the past LSAT days here. So we take it right from the LSAT.
It's funny, as soon as I heard about this, I remembered distinctly when you and I first encountered this, because we'd been talking a little bit. This first came up in an experimental back in November of 2019, I think, 2021. So 3 years ago. And we had talked about the idea of like the test measures kind of leaning into pop culture and topicality, passages about Outcast, passages about Twilight, passages about the Golden Girls, and then Rakim. And we were like, these are coming, guys. These will be scored soon enough. This is the first of that subset to kind of hit the market, but here we are.
Yeah, and it means that if you do happen to see something random about the Golden Girls or what have you, it could very well be real. In this case, this passage set was. But anyway, we didn't have to go too far to find the song, although I already had multiple songs picked out that we could have chosen from. I've been to a bunch of concerts recently, so I was like, all right, but I'll save those for next time.
Yeah, if anything, now we've got a backlog, which is always nice.
Oh, yeah. Always like that.
Let's get into the LSAT world.
Let's get in.
Oh, beat you to it.
The words right out of my mouth.
All right, so what do I do? Tests first, do you think? We're staring down the end of the year. I'm gonna lump January of 2025 into this. The October test obviously just wrapped up. The scores of that will come out on Wednesday, October 23rd, that morning, assuming you have a writing sample complete. So make sure you've done that. If you don't have one on record, you need to. The next test that's official, that's coming up, it's just staring us down, is the November 2024 test. The registration deadline for that, unfortunately, at this point has passed. It was September 26th. The test dates there are Wednesday through Saturday, so we're going back to a Wednesday 4-day schedule that's normal. It'll start on the 16th of November. It'll run through the 9th, I think.
6th through the 9th.
Sorry. Somebody may have made a typo in our notes, and I'm not going to point fingers.
I actually just switched it last minute. That was my fault. It's the 6th through the 9th.
Yeah, I can read. Dave can't type. But the 6th through the 9th, Wednesday through Saturday.
Be like that, huh?
All night, baby.
You better put your guard up now.
Oh, God, help me. I don't have enough bourbon. The scores will come out the day before Thanksgiving, which should be interesting. That's on Wednesday morning, November 27th. And then just to flash forward into the new year, the January test. You can still register for that. In fact, you've got about a month and a half, a little over. December 3rd is the registration
Almost
deadline.
2 months, actually.
Fair enough. I can't add. You can't type. We're quite a pair. The test dates for that, I can feel it already. The test dates for the January test are January 15th through the 18th, another Wednesday to Saturday test. Those scores will come out on Wednesday, February 5th. So there you go.
Couple of LSATs there. Interestingly enough, though, John, as always, we're running webinars that go around these exams. So there's always a series of free ones. I'm not going to mention all of those. In fact, I'm going to mention something instead that relates to an announcement that you and I made today.
Yeah, today.
Which is that we got, after the crystal ball for October and November, which we did probably a couple weeks ago, we were asked, are you going to do one specifically for November? And we said, we'll have to wait and see how October goes. October, as we will talk about in just a few minutes, went very well. And so a lot of the content that we had actually thrown out there as being likely to be reused, that is actually off the list now. And more than enough of it was removed from the list that we're going to go ahead and do a mini ball, which is our update to the main crystal ball for the November LSAT. That is going to be on October 23rd, which I believe is a Wednesday. I believe that's also the day scores come out that morning. So if you are not certain if you're taking November or not, and you're waiting to see what your October scores are, we'll do it that evening at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. That is actually available on our website to register for. You just go to the top. It says like LSAT resources, and there's a webinar list. You can go there and it is listed there. Yeah. And as before, John, this is free to everybody and it is publicly available. You do not have to be a PowerScore student. We're not going to put it behind any kind of registration paywall or anything like that. We're not going to show LSAT questions, so we don't need to make it private. It'll be free for all. And if you miss it, you'll actually be able to go back and put the registration link in and still get it afterwards.
That's exactly right. Can I elaborate on that in 2 parts briefly?
And do what you want.
Thanks, bud.
You were going to do it anyway, so let's go ahead.
Don't give me that kind of license.
There you go.
I've got enough questions that I do think this actually bears some investigation. I think you and I are about to record another podcast on the heels of this one that explores the nature of what the crystal balls are. And I think driven in part because we just get asked so often about like, how do these work? Or how do you guys do that? Or what are you trying to predict? Or what can I take away from either attending live, which is always my favorite part, or reviewing the video. So that's part 1. I think we're going to explore that a bit. Part 2 is that if you are able to attend live, please do. You get to interact with some of our best instructors. You get to interact with me and Dave, which is kind of neat. Guess which one I recommend? And
me.
Of course it was. The whole time. And also, if you're registered for it, even if you aren't able to attend live, we will send you a video link. And I've been doing that for people through the last week. So sign up, even if you can't make it on the 23rd, which I hope you can. We will send you a link to the recording of it.
Outstanding. So let's move on to the October 2024 LSAT.
Here we go.
See what's up with this test. Get this thing underway. First off, this was a sizable test.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, at the end of this, I'll compare it to what's going on with November right now. But as you kind of we've talked about before, this is a weird test because there's a hole in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And I think, as we'll kind of mention later on, I believe this led to more content being used than usual. But it started out on Tuesday, October 1st, and usually it starts on Wednesday.
Yeah.
So this was already unusual, and to be honest, from my perspective, annoying. And about 5,500 people probably took the test on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, it was about 5,650 people that took it. So you've got over 11,000 people on the first 2 days. And then they took a break on Thursday for Rosh Hashanah. So they did not have any testing whatsoever. And my suspicion is due to security concerns. They were like, let's use a few more sections in both RC and LR just to kind of keep people off balance, which is incredibly annoying to both you and I, John. They came back on Friday the 4th, and you had about 5,900 people. And that was actually the largest of the 3 testing days. And Saturday, which I would have always thought was going to be the largest day, it was the last day, 5,100. It was actually the smallest of the 4 days. So very odd the way they had that made up. But that was about 22,000 and change in terms of the number of students who actually took the test. And I won't put you under any kind of like pressure here, John, but the November LSAT registration at the moment is one of the highest I've seen in a long time in the modern era. Not back when we had 4 tests, because you got some serious enrollments when there was 4 tests a year.
Upper 30s or something?
We are at 42,000 plus. Now that's going to come down because we're going to lose people from October who are satisfied with how they did, and they won't take November. And there's always what we call the melt.
Right.
Everybody in this field talks about the melt.
Attrition, sure.
Yeah, you will lose up to say 25% of enrollees, but this November is starting to look like an exceedingly large test overall. Now, what we just finished was the main test administration.
Yeah.
There is one more test that's coming up in about a week and a day or so. That is coming up on Tuesday in a week. That is the makeup exam. And as we'll talk about in a second, there'll probably be a few more makeup testers than normally would be the case. But anytime someone has a problem with the exam, one of the options they have, or should at least be offered if the problems are severe enough, is to make up the exam later on.
Yeah.
Usually that is a different test than the ones we're about to talk about and recap. So just be aware of that. Usually they give you something else entirely.
Yeah, test this big. But before you move on, and I know where you're headed, test this big do tend to invite a lot of content, a lot of variety of content and sections. We're going to see, I mean, what were there, 5 reading comps that were scored, 7 total with experimentals between the domestic and international tests. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces. If November's that big, I think we're in for a fun time, Dave.
Yeah, if October is any indication and November ends up being like 8 to 10,000 more test takers, we're going to have a lot of content on our hands. That could be a real challenge. I can say that you and I both spent a lot of time trying to sort things out, and it was a lot of work. I'm not looking forward to more work.
There's a reason we're doing this so late on a Monday is we spent even today piecing the things together. I can only speak for myself on this part, but looking for a very high place to jump from. I couldn't find one, so here I am. But it was a long, long week trying to sort things out.
I know you love trampolining, so
that's exactly
I'm glad that you're going to go out there and relax and spend your time bouncing off.
I had a very sturdy umbrella. That's exactly what
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens with that. That's something that I think we'll allude to once or twice more during this conversation. But let's talk a little bit about the test and the proctor kind of issues. You know, for the last several exams, we've been really fortunate not to see anything systemic occurring. That was not the case this time, unfortunately.
One crept in, didn't it?
Yeah, it was limited though, and I was at least happy to see LSAC getting ahead of this. They realized they were having a problem on Friday with the proctoring for remote test takers.
Yeah.
And it wasn't everybody, but apparently some people were getting hung up in kind of like the waiting room prior to entering the main testing room, and it was almost like they'd been ghosted. No proctor ever showed up. They were just sitting there. And I saw them post an announcement about it. I obviously posted one on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. And I saw a million posts that people made on various forums about
Twitter.
Twix, I think is my favorite. Regardless, I posted it as soon as I talked to LSAC, and I knew they were working on it, and they were very clear that some people, not all, are having this problem, and they were able to fix that within a few hours, and then it did not crop up again on Saturday. But those students on Friday were apparently offered either the retake, they could go on Saturday and get rescheduled, because again, interestingly enough, it was the smallest of the 4 days, so they had open slots, or they could push for the retake on this upcoming Tuesday.
Yeah.
And so they had that particular choice. And we've said this before, outages do happen. It's very difficult to control. Sometimes the technical ones don't bother me as much as the proctor ones, where the proctors do something foolish. And of course, we heard stories like that as we do every single LSAT. It is a structural element to taking this test now. So if you were affected, sorry to hear it, because I know that sucks.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're able to like reschedule on Saturday and get things going. If not, maybe look on the bright side. You got another week and a few days to prepare for the upcoming makeup exam. Let's hope that goes well for everybody.
Sure. It's funny, the luck of the draw aspect of this is something I've been having a lot of conversations about in large relation to the crystal ball.
Yeah, totally.
So much of it, so many people wrote me and were like, you saved my entire test experience. Other people wrote to me and were like, I didn't have a single thing you predicted.
And they're mad about it, which I understand. Unfortunately, and we'll get to it, we don't have control over everything because we're not actually making the test.
Thank goodness we're not.
Before you get into that crystal ball discussion, because I think we'll probably have more than a few things to say about that, and we then talk a little bit more about the test content, I'm just going to go through a few reminders, disclaimers on how this works. I'm going to try to do it fast. I'm in that, I want to move.
Well, I've got whiskey,
tonight.
So take your time.
Yeah, you go right ahead and drink your college Maker's Mark.
Cheers. Yeah. Slow as you like, brother.
You know what kind of beer I drank in college a lot?
You're going to say something snobby.
No.
No?
I drank a lot of Lone Star, which is like literally at that point in time one of the worst tasting beers ever. I will say this though. Yeah. Huh. You think I had money?
I've always thought you had money.
I just act like it. I didn't at that point. I will say that one time, I think my parents sent me $100, so I went down to the liquor store because, at that point, they didn't check anything. Yep. And I bought 3 cases of Lowenbrau because I'd seen Lowenbrau beer on a commercial, and I just thought it was really cool. They showed like the Pacific Coast Highway, and it was like, if it's Lowenbrau, it's, the good life or something. So we drank Lowenbrau for one night, and that was a lot of fun. Anyway.
How about that? All right. I learn stuff about you every day.
It wasn't Maker's Mark, and I wasn't drinking it on the regular. Lone Star is so bad, sometimes we washed the glasses out and thought there's something wrong with the glass, and then we put the beer back in and discovered, no, it was just Lone Star smelled bad.
Yeah.
In any event.
All right, you going to do a summary here?
I sure am.
Okay. I don't want to be mid-sentence when I'm supposed to say something and I'm chugging Maker's Mark.
Nope.
Okay.
You go ahead, start drinking.
Thanks, brother.
All right. Everything we talk about here, especially the curve predictions, please don't summarize these online. There's a lot of nuance to what we talk about, and there is again tonight, so we'd prefer that people hear what we say directly. One thing I'll remind everybody is your section order does not mean you had the same test as somebody else. We see this every single time. I say it every single time, but sections and orders and content change all day long. The next thing I'll remind everybody is that when you take the LSAT, it almost always feels worse than any practice tests you've taken. It's just not the same type of experience. You get a negativity bias that creeps into your recollections. That really colors the way you think about things, and that is absolutely normal. A lot of times people come out and say, that was the hardest test I've ever taken, and it probably was in their minds because of the actual anxiety and pressure they faced. Just be aware of the fact that you can still perform extremely well, even if you don't feel great about how you've done. And when we talk about difficulty even, and we say something's easier or harder, just keep in mind that to us, everything is overall difficult on the LSAT. This is all just relative. If it's an easier section, it's hard. It's not the hardest section we've ever seen. I'll also remind everybody that when you're trying to figure things out and you're talking to your friends, the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. We see this on virtually every LSAT. We saw it again. For example, there's 2 RC sections that have some type of architecture passage on them. And it was really easy to watch people get confused thinking they had the same architecture passage and therefore the same section, and then discover later on, or maybe they'll discover it tonight, it was not the case. You can't assume that because you saw a certain topic in a very broad sense, and then someone else mentions that same broad topic, that it was the same thing. Also keep in mind that our estimations of real and experimental sections are based on assumptions about reusage, namely that if something was real before, it will be real again. So far, we have not been wrong in identifying something that was real, and we don't think we're wrong again. However, it is possible you may not hear your section discussed. So we're saying we think we have all the real sections. We don't think we know we haven't identified anything that's not real. However, is it possible that we've missed a section or two? Entirely.
Yeah.
There are many different forms of this test. Some of them are given to a huge percentage of test takers. Some of them are given to a very small percentage of test takers. If we don't hear from somebody, we have no way of including it into the information that we are presenting. So if you do happen to be a person who says, hey, I don't think you covered that, tell us. Then we'll add it to our records, and then the next time will be even better. And then the last thing is, all that we ask is, please don't summarize this online. Just send them to the podcast. It's free. They can hear me and Jon bicker and enjoy that. So well, there you go.
I enjoy it. There we go. Thanks, bud. To double down on one of those points, I feel like there might be an LR section somewhere out there, kind of in the wilderness, floating, ghosting
it's
itself
possible.
around. So
it'd be most likely.
Yeah, LR for sure. RC we've got. In fact, I've been watching official threads online that lack some of the RC that we've got. So I feel good about that. But LR,
that's,
I do think...
the majority of it.
Yeah. Sadly, yeah. And the most predicted majority, which is kind of gratifying, and we'll get to in about 3 minutes. But LR does feel like there could be something that's stray. If that's the case, just let us know. We try to be exhaustive, but we're not always perfect.
I think it's a matter of the quality of the input that we get then allows us to connect to the database that we have, which we know is high quality, and then that kind of input affects the output. If we don't hear about a section, or it's not clear that it's the section that somebody thinks that it is, or that we think that it is, we won't talk about it. There's been times when we're like, we're not sure. Let's not say something official. I'd rather say nothing. So it is definitely possible. And keep in mind, one of the questions that I got, I don't remember what night it was, but it must have been Saturday. Someone was trying to figure out what was real and what was experimental, and I was trying to help them. And then when I told them, they seemed to be very unhappy about that piece of information. And so then I started getting questions like, how do you know? I'm like, bite the hand that feeds, why don't you?
Which we actually have a pretty good response to. That's the podcast that I referred earlier that I think we're about to record. It'll explain that to some extent.
It will explain that, but a lot of what is happening here is that a lot of these sections are being reused. Something that might have been reused a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. We have records of that. Now, was that section ever released to the public? No, it was not. So they can reuse it again after everybody's forgotten about it after a year or so. That's how this works. But every single time this has happened, it basically turns out that on a main administration test, if something was scored before, and you can prove it for a fact, like if somebody has 1 RC on their test and 3 LR, you know that's a real RC. So if it appears in a year from now, we'll know that it is real again. That has always been the consistent track record. We track all that. That's our job, I think, is the way you and I look at it. So as I've said before, we have never been wrong. And we've been doing this for years, literally hundreds of test forms, really thousands of test forms, hundreds of administrations. Yeah. So sometimes I hate delivering bad news, because in this case, I had to say to the person, I was like, I'm really sorry, you know, but this is the way that it is. And I know that it is this way because this section has been used multiple times before. So
yeah, I had to drop a few of those bombs too, but
it sucks. It's not my favorite thing to do.
It's just truth. I said to a few people, like, do you want me to be Oprah or do you want to hear the truth? And someone responded to me on Reddit. I think they deleted the comment, although I hope not. Where they were like, the way you talk to people on here. And I was like, I'm just trying to be whimsically informative. This is what this is. We're just about to tell you the truth of what happened. And the good news is we know exactly what happened. The bad news is I probably could do a better job. Well,
you drink too much Makers. Anyway. That's probably what the effect is. Let's start with the crystal ball. All right. And we're going to combine everything tonight. A lot of times we do a special international discussion followed by a domestic discussion. We're not going to do that tonight. We saw some crossover between the two. We're just going to do all the RC, and then we're going to do all the LR, and everyone's just going to have to track what they had. But if you're an international tester, we saw a bunch of sections that went mostly to international testers, not entirely. And if you're a domestic tester, we saw several sections that were mostly for domestic testers, but sometimes were used outside that. It was a very odd scenario. But crystal ball review is what we always start this with. How did it go?
Yeah, you want me to do it. Well, one of the interesting things... You drink. One of the interesting things here is that even during the live crystal ball event, we had asked questions about the applicability to international tests. So that's always on our mind. We don't typically gear things towards that because international tests are sort of a free-for-all, or at least historically they have been. Much harder to identify in terms of like an algorithmic, patternistic thing that you and I have kind of, I think, cracked. Internationals have been tricky, but man, we got this one right kind of globally, which is neat. So let me break down the test that we saw and use both domestically and internationally, unless you have a thing you want to start with.
I want to throw something in.
Please.
This is something I've been telling people from both the international test-taking community and the makeup test-taking community. They ask me whether or not the crystal ball applies, and I say it's not designed to. We're not specifically trying to predict those tests because they are small administrations with a much higher degree of variability. However, in a number of cases, and this is certainly one of them, they have applied. So I'm like, it still can be highly useful, and regardless, the problem sets will still be helpful to do no matter which test you take.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to throw that in there because I get that question so much, and I think it's a good question. We're not saying that it applies, but it keeps applying. So maybe, who knows, in a year we'll come back and be like, yeah, it actually does apply because it's happened, 12 times in a row now.
Sure.
Anyway, on to what you were saying.
On to what I was saying. And that's a really good point. I'm glad you added it. We've been doing this for roughly 4 years or something now.
Yeah.
And we've never really made it a point to try to get into the exact internationals or even sections that we thought would be reused until about one crystal ball ago. And that's when we actually started to narrow it down by section. And that was a unique thing for us to do. I mean, the whole thing's unique for us to do, but that was the first time we'd ever tried to get that precise, that surgical with it. And we did again and sort of put our reputation on the line a little bit. And here's what happened. We predicted a very specific logical reasoning reuse, a specific section that we said was going to come from January of 2021. And that was the main logical reasoning content, both overseas and domestically. That's incredible. So we told people around the world, basically, not just we expected a test that they would encounter, we expected a specific logical reasoning section that they would encounter. And they did. Say something.
Which is, I'm gonna.
I knew you were.
Which is cool. But, the initial response that I would have as a student is, that's great, but they never released it. So what is it going to help me?
Yeah.
Great. You guys were right about January 2021 LRs being used, and that's fantastic. That doesn't help me at all. Except it does, because as we've talked about in the crystal ball, and something that, we're trying to add more and more of, is this discussion of, wait a second, because we have this idea that it is going to work, we then make choices as to what we recommend to you to make sure you've studied. The problem sets that we kind of piece together, the sections that we suggest. And one of the things that was super gratifying to me this administration was a lot of people saying the LR that I did on the Power Score suggestion was right on the money.
Yeah.
Now, all we're saying is, hey, this is a supplement. This is something we want you to do in addition to all the other regular studying you should be doing. You should still be studying assumption questions and resolve questions and all that kind of stuff. It's not your only course of study, and I don't think anyone's treating it that way. But as a supplement, it's proving to be super valuable. And of course, John, you haven't mentioned this yet, but some of the RC topics that we put up there also appeared. And so it was a hit on both LR and RC. And from when we do the mini ball, we'll go into this. We'll actually review what happened this time and eliminate that content and then add in new content for the November mini ball.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That was my next sentence. Although I will say, to echo a thing that you mentioned, I heard from, I couldn't even begin to count it, hundreds and hundreds of people who said exactly what you just said, which was like, I studied this and so I knew that. Or I practiced this thing and so I was ready for that thing. Over and over, I heard that hundreds of times. It was really, really gratifying. And again, the fact that we're this accurate with it allows us to be. Let's talk about RC. To me, this is actually more fun.
And I think this section, we'll move through it relatively quickly.
Yeah, because there's a lot to get through, frankly. If we slowed down here, we'd both fall asleep.
No. I mean, there's 5 scored sections and 2 experimental RCs.
We got 7 RCs to get to, and I'm not even there yet. So
All right.
Yeah,
Well, then I'll start and do the first one or two. How's that?
Can I say this first?
What?
That we leaned way into January 2023 as the most expected section. And sure enough, every topic from that test appeared on this one as the most commonly tested RC content. So, I don't know if you can tell. I've literally got bruises from backpedal.
I'll let you,
right.
How about I'll do the first two here, and then you can flip over on the third.
Yeah, all right.
I think that'll be the one that'll make you the happiest.
Okay.
All right. So let's start with scored reading comprehension. All right. This was a 27 question section. It has been used multiple times in the past. It started off back in September 2017 as an experimental section that was used again in January 2020 as an experimental section. Appeared also on the June 21 LSAT as a scored section and the April 2023 LSAT as a scored section.
Both of which were predicted, by the way.
Yes. And they had tested this one out and they had kind of messed around with it. And then here you go. It was used 2 times prior to this, and it pops up, and here is our content. The first passage is about Vera Brittain, who was, pro-war, and then she became a pacifist after that. Then you have the Inuits in Canada, the Nunavutts forming their own governing territory, kind of like a representative government discussion. And the third passage was law-related, basically byproduct versus enrichment courts, 2 types of really models or schools that account for how judges add new legal rules and principles to the existing set that they have. And then the last one, which I think is the one that a lot of people really disliked, which was keystone predators. This was the comparative. They talked about keystone species like starfish, some spiders, and so forth, and how they contribute to biodiversity and ecosystems. And so that was your one of the 5 sections that were out there that were floating around. And we'll come back to the difficulty discussion when we go through it, but that's number 1 on the list. I think that last passage in particular bothered a lot of people because it's a little more scientifically focused.
Can I add a small sub-point to the
I knew you would.
Of course, as I do. A small one is that I included a passage in the recommended problem set or passage set in the latest Crystal Ball about food adaptation, specifically from PT 150. That was directly related to that keystone predators, biodiversity. That was about starfish and other things, giraffes maybe, spiders for sure, and how they can disrupt an ecosystem based on what they eat. I put a passage there for people to read about that. So this all is, again, part of the web we weave.
I think it's a good example of the subtleties of the choices that we're making, or even if we didn't predict this directly,
and we wouldn't,
as kind of a topic.
The 4th reuse or something.
Exactly. We're not trying to predict a section like this that has been reused this many times because they can just use it at any point in time. But we are at times looking to say, well, is there something that we think is similar to this because we think it does have a high chance of being used? That's where the problem sets come in.
Thematically, exactly, yeah.
Thematically, it's not going to be the same, and it's not the exact passage because they haven't released these. And again, so if you're thinking to yourself, I want to go read this Keystone Predators if they use it in June 21 and April 23. No, those were non-disclosed tests. They put the book back on the shelf after they showed it to you, and they said, we're going to hold it to reuse it again. And that was the analogy that I used in the Crystal Ball. You're going to hear me use that analogy probably again here in the November mini ball. I think it's pretty on the money. All right, let's go to the next scored section. And this was also 27 questions. This is a newly scored section for them. However, it last appeared in November of 2021 as an experimental section. All right, so let's walk our way through the topics that we have here. The first passage is about German theorists and scientific development, basically the Naturphilosophen and the theory of recapitulation. I don't think this was super difficult, but of course, nobody really, I think, gets into German kind of like schools of thought. The second passage, I think, for some people was really very cool. They really liked the idea of it. It was about rap and our friend Rakim and poetry. It quoted lyrics and talked about the, essentially the high quality. They used "Follow the Leader" as an example, and I think it was a little harder than probably the first one. But they were kind of talking about the goals of rap and arguing about how things worked. The third one was about video games and research at the University of Rochester and about how action games were being studied there. Yeah. And there were benefits such as attention span and fields of recognition and so forth. and probably not the easiest passage. I think this section got harder as things went on. And then the last one, neuroimaging in courts. This was the comparative passage, and whether or not this neuroimaging can be used to influence court decisions and the likelihood of reoffending or determining the properties. There's also another relatively tougher passage compared to the first two that you faced. But that was another scored section, and that's why we're calling that one Rakim. And the song that we chose was kind of like a Rakim throwback from the Eric B. and Rakim days.
Yeah. In terms of prediction, of course, this was a new section. It's the first time we've seen it ever be scored, so we couldn't have predicted this in terms of content. But again, I have to think that the suggestions that we made in terms of what people study, spot on. But it gets better. You're going to give me...
It does get better.
Yeah, you're going to give me the real slam dunk here, aren't you?
1 second. I'm gonna make a point here, and then I'll turn it over to you, okay? So in the first two sections... Sorry about that.
You're fine.
Sometimes people come in and they're like, oh, none of the topics that, I had were predicted by the crystal ball. Well, both of these sections are great examples of why they wouldn't be. The first one's been used too many times for us to think that there's kind of like pressure to use it or need to use it. The second one has never been used as a scored section before, so we can't predict that. Yep. These are the items that I talked about in the crystal ball where I said, we're not trying to predict certain things. What we are trying to predict is something like the next one. And John, that's your cue.
Oh, the alley-oop. Here we go. Section 3 that we saw, and this was mostly domestic, but I think some people overseas saw it as well. So again, regardless of where you are listening to this very likely applied to you. 27 questions, and it was not just predicted by the source test, it was actually predicted to the topic. All 4 of these topics were listed in our crystal ball. Specifically, this came from the January 2023 LSAT. This was the first reuse, which is exactly what Dave and I try to anticipate. And in this case, we got it right, thank goodness. One passage was about architecture, education. I'm still struggling over the pronunciation of this word. I don't know if it's atelier or atelier. What do you think?
No, you got it right the first time, atelier.
I usually do. Versus university. There was a passage about Thomas Malthus and Arthur Young, who was a diarist, and population growth in the French Revolution. In fact, not only do we expect this passage, I specifically put a French Revolution passage in the recommended problem setter passage set in the latest crystal ball. It's from PT 111, passage number 1. So again, we had really confident hopes that this was coming. Sure enough. The comparative passage in this set was about brand values and how when companies buy other companies, they measure intangible assets. And then the fourth passage was about Patricia Cowings and space motion sickness and experiments that they've done essentially on astronauts as to how the inner ear works with motion sickness. So there you go. But every single one of those, I'm going to echo a thing you've done already, which is specify something. I saw a couple of people be like, oh yeah, of course they can predict what's coming when they talk about it's just going to be about courtrooms. And you, I thought, it made me laugh anyway. You were like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
But I was thinking, of course, like we are so much more specific than that. I literally listed Patricia Cowings' name in the crystal ball. I talked about Thomas Malthus in the French Revolution and then gave a French Revolution passage. This is not broad swings. These are not generic topics. This is exactly what we expect to happen. And when it does, of course, and as it almost always does, we look the way that we feel right now, which is celebratory.
Well, I think sometimes I ask myself whether or not our competitors are out there like, no, it's so broad, it doesn't matter, because I've seen that criticism a few times and I just laugh. I'm like, if we put Patricia Cowing's space motion as a suggested topic to learn about, you think that's broad? Yeah. Okay, I'd like to see...
Anybody could have seen that coming.
Anybody could have seen Patricia Cowing's coming. Ridiculous.
Sure.
It's like the Zora Neale Hurston one before. It's like, oh, anyone could have picked her out.
That Cascadia earthquake in 1700 that led to Japanese tsunamis and ghost forests? I mean, didn't we all?
Whenever I see those criticisms, I immediately laugh. Right. I'm like, that's either someone who hasn't watched it and just thinks we're saying, okay, court, There's a courtroom one, there's a science one. I'm like, well, if that's what this was, it would be very, very easy to get it right every single time. That is not what we are attempting to do.
I should elaborate too that we're not doing a victory lap for our own sake here. We're simply saying that there are things about this test that are predictable to the point that you and I can see them coming. And
I don't think it's a victory lap. I think the issue is that you have your victory lap.
Thanks, but
there's a lack of understanding about what it is we're attempting to do and how it works, and that's frustrating to us. And I think we get on the student side, it's like, stop talking about this. I totally get you. We will. But for us, there's like 100 times every one of these tests that each one of us is asked about, well, how, why, what. That's ridiculous. And I'm like, no, there is a science to what we are doing. I like to think there's a little science and magic in there.
There's some alchemy to it.
The interesting thing, though, is those first three sets were largely domestically used. That's where we saw the majority of usages that were in there. And especially with this third one, John, for some of our students in particular, it was really great because they had this early in the test. They had this as their first or second section. And so they knew when they hit it, because they'd seen these topics in the crystal ball, they're like, this thing's real.
Yeah.
Obviously, that gives you a heightened sense of awareness. It also means that if they had another RC section out there, they knew that one wasn't going to be scored because we don't predict experimental sections. We are only predicting content that is real. And this is another misconception that obviously we're trying to address here. So for some people, this is what you said before, the casino effect of some people get lucky, some people don't. There were certain people out there who are like, I knew it. I'd studied those. I knew it was real. I got a big bonus there, and I kind of cruise controlled the second section. And we always say, do the second RC just to make sure. Don't trust anybody. But in this particular case, this was real. All right, let's not continue offending everybody.
I've got more to say, but I'm not gonna. I think you've covered it.
Let's go to a couple real sections here, and I'll pick up the pace.
Let's go international, because I think there's probably some
these were
overseas
mostly internationally used sections. Not to say they were only international, but we saw more international usage than not. And I think it tells you something. There were two different scored RCs in the international front, because it's not usually a very large cohort of students. It's about 1,000 people. I think that day off in the middle of testing forced a lot of extra sections to be used out there. Here is the first one. This is one that has appeared a couple times before, March of 2022 and November of 2023. It's got a passage about Mayan civilization collapse theories. There is more than one passage out there that's floating around about the Mayans and droughts and civilization collapse. This isn't the only one, but this particular section also had genetically modified foods and risks versus traditional crops. Samuel Beckett, the playwright, being strict, and then intellectual, not international property, but intellectual property law and copyright, as well as economics. That was a scored section, and the GMO was the comparative there. The other section that we saw for a lot of international students that was real was about Galileo's mistaking Dante's Inferno, uncivil disobedience and civil disobedience, the privatization of water use, and the Mexican photographer Graciela Iturbide.
Oh, buddy. Well done. Chef's kiss.
Yeah. I knew you couldn't say it, so I took that one for you.
I butcher it every time. And by every time, that is, what, the fourth time? August 22, April 24.
It's come up. If you want to know, actually, John, the last time you did it, you did pretty well.
Oh, thanks, man.
I just don't trust you with any kind of word that requires any kind of accent or finesse.
Facility. Intonation. All right.
Anyway, if you count all those out, those are the 5 real sections. So one of those that you had out there was one of those 5, and that would have been the scored one. But there were some experimentals floating around, not as many as I expected. Let's just go ahead and cover those, and then, John, I'll turn the LR over to you.
Yeah, it's fun.
Okay, the first of the experimentals that we saw was 27 questions, and it had topics like there was a warehouse fire. I think it was Universal Studios. The music was lost and so forth, a recording area. Old growth forests, the emotional law approach, and the relationship between lawyers and clients. And then LLMs, large language learning models, And that was the last one. And I feel like the LLM one is starting to get into that modern era. They're testing out more modernized things. But this one was not scored. So no matter where you had it, whether it was section 1, 2, 3, or 4, that was experimental. And then the other experimental that we saw largely on the weekend, it seemed like, but of course not entirely. This is just kind of tendencies. Talked about the Indus River Valley symbol writing. Another passage about architecture.
Mm-hmm. This was so much confusion right there.
Yeah, this caused a lot of confusion because people were like, I saw that architecture passage, it's like different one. This was more about criticism. Then a really interesting one that I think I could kind of get into, ear witness evidence.
This caused a lot of confusion too, because we talked about eyewitness lineups and police profiling in the crystal ball. And so a lot of people were like, oh, heard about that one. I was like, it's not the same thing.
No, you didn't.
Man. Nah.
We're specific for a reason.
We're way more
we just didn't say, this is the classic. We didn't say courtroom evidence, which could have been either one of those passages. Yeah. We try to get specific because we know this type of thing is happening. And then the last passage in that section was glaciers and the indications about global warming. And again, space was brought into this. And so that was another overlap with crystal ball topics. So like, oh, I remember space. No, that's a different one. This was not the Patricia Cowings space motion sickness.
I actually forgot about that one until you just brought it up.
This should be fair warning, though, to anybody who's looking at this and is kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to look at these topics. This is not about generalizing. The test makers know what they're doing. It's no accident that there's two passages about architecture, but they're in totally different sections. This is an intentional obfuscation technique. They are trying to confuse you and make it harder for you to figure out what is actually going on. I think that's totally reasonable. That's their job. Just like, John, and as you explained on Reddit, it's our job to figure out what the test makers are doing, and we both have our tools and weapons, and we fight this way. Sometimes they're going to win. A lot of times we're going to win. I like winning, so let's keep winning here.
Yeah, don't blame me for being a clever mouse. Just build a better mousetrap.
Well, somebody was giving you, I think they were asking you a question like, you think it's fair? And I think the analogy I said to you didn't use it, which offended me. I said, people complaining about what we have to say about the LSAT is about watching an NFL football game or a college football game and complaining about what the announcers are saying affecting the game. I'm like, we're the announcers here, man. The coaches and the players down on the field, which is LSAC, they're the ones that need to be better, not us. We're just commenting on it.
I thought it was a perfect analogy. You just said it after I was very quick to post. So
I would have changed your comment to include it, but whatever.
Yeah. God, you're no. All right, let's talk. Let's talk about logical reasoning. If you're listening to this and you can't tell, Dave and I are brothers, and we love each other very much. But occasionally we get very sleepy, and so chippy.
I'm not sleepy.
What? Just me then?
You're
fine. No,
you're the one that's fatigued here.
I'm an absolute grouch right now, so don't mess with
me.
You
are. Yeah. I can really tell, so I'm giving it back to you like twice as much. Anyway,
I'd say bring it, but don't. I just want to cuddle. All right, let's talk logical reasoning. Interestingly enough, there were fewer logical reasoning sections, domestic and abroad, than I saw in NRC. Although, again, I'll put the same disclaimer on this, and Dave, you can echo it. There's a very reasonable chance that we've missed one, or that there's some outlier, obscure thing that appeared for somebody. If that's the case, we didn't hear from you. And that's okay, but do let us know, because we will update things. For now, I saw 4 logical reasoning sections that I know were scored. And we're not going to cover experimental logical reasoning. We never do. It confuses things. And Dave, you can break that trend if you want. I didn't think so. Let's talk about
one comment at the end, or you can.
You want to make one comment? It seems like you really got your foot on it. Go for it.
No.
Okay. Well, then make us all wait, I guess. Let's talk about the real scored logical reasoning. The first one that we saw, 25 questions, I believe, and I'm not going to do question counts for all these, but this is what I'm confident about because we've seen it before. We saw this in January of 2021. Interestingly enough, this was not just a test whose reuse we predicted. This specific section of logical reasoning we predicted was coming, and this is it. This takes it off the table. Here were some of the topics. If you had these, they counted. So if you had 3 logical reasonings, this is one of your sections. These were scored. Elephants being selectively bred and domestication program. Aristotle and education of youth with honesty and value kind of principles. I think it was like a long-term thing. Supermarkets, labeling bad nutrition on produce, I believe, but certainly items for sale. Salt mineral licks. A lot of people were talking about this. I think it had to do with elephants, but continuing on. Tomatoes as a fruit or vegetable, another question that came up a bunch. And then one I really want to read. Nile crocodiles swimming across the Atlantic Ocean. I assume west. So
how else would they get here from the Nile?
The Nile might be where they ended up. I think it's probably origin.
Did they go east across the Atlantic?
I didn't take the test. I don't know. Anyway, that was a real section of content. Clearly, there were about 20 more questions in there, but those all counted. Let me give you another one. Interestingly, we first saw this next section from the same test administration, a different set, and a set that actually has been reused since its origin. So this was January 2021, and then again January 2023. I'm going to give a few more topics in this because a lot of confusion around this section. There's a question in this about George Orwell, I believe his book Coming Up for Air. Bad scholarship, sports teams. There was one about squirrels, brown and silver-tailed squirrels. Speaking of hair color, hair pigment was in this. The question I might have seen the most of all, Dave, Loch Ness Monster. Again, one I really want to read. That and crocodiles are up there. There's a question about the Earth and Moon and the origin. Story for both that the moon is not formed from the same materials as the Earth. It was one about Shakespeare. There was one about orcas eating sea lions, I believe. Egyptian dice and carving, ancient carvings on Egyptian dice. These were all in the same section. Another question I saw a lot in this was cougars eating bighorn sheep in national parks. And I'll give two more. Scraping tools and how people constructed clothing out of animal hides in the olden days. And then pollinating low bush blackberry bushes and the presence essentially of black flies that help to pollinate. So there you go.
All right, let's continue on to some more of the LR.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at another section that I think we saw both domestically and internationally. A lot of these were 25 questions. I think this one was as well. Here's a few topics here. Food trucks, marine fossil records, gas tax and farmers, the bending of light and the theory of relativity, more money to build electric cars for the environment, and then a blood glucose and memory question in there. Another section out there, I think this might have been 26. It might have been the only 26 that was used. We've seen this before. We saw it in August 2022 and April 2024. Also appeared to have been domestic and international. We've got ancient charcoal writing in caves, insulin and oats, bread and health and myopia, Earth's ozone, caffeine and coffee grounds versus tea, salmon and insecticide, bullfrogs and ponds, leaping or jumping, and then cereal brand executives. Yeah. That sounds like quite a job.
You listed 3 questions in there in a row that I think are probably the most common topics, which are the caffeine and coffee versus tea, the salmon and insecticides, and then the bullfrogs leaping.
Yep. And, it's funny because we talked about like 4 sections. I really do think there's another section that's floating around out there. And, there's just so much information when it comes in. And I think sometimes you and I, John, we'll get a test report that's like, oh, I had 1 RC and 3 LR. Yeah. And the RC is pretty detailed. Like, oh, is this, and this? And we're like, okay, that matches with this. And then the LR is like, the first section was tough. The second one, I'm not so sure about. And the third one had, a nature question. Yeah. I'm like, we're in trouble.
Yeah. So I should clarify for the sake of my own reputation, tenuous at best, which is to say that when I started talking about the scored sections we were going to run through, I mentioned 4 LRs. There are 4 that I can confidently attest to. There are some scattered questions, but I'm not quite sure where they go. And I feel like that's kind of where you're headed.
There's a ton of scattered questions that I think we could probably put down about 30 or 40 easily. There is a section out there that I can't tell if it overlaps with these. I don't think that it does, but it's a section that's got a question about Chinese beer and barley and the history, kind of like where, the origination of the equipment. There's one about penguins, fur, and heat retention. Another about dark matter. We saw the question about Einstein before, and you're like, wait, dark matter, could that be it? Also underwater pressure waves and bike locks. And I think there's a question in there about a guy named Jon, but with an H, not just Jon like you.
Which is just fancy.
I know. Boy, these extra letters. It's inefficient, man.
Really inefficient.
Sorry to all Johns.
I had a very lazy grandmother
inefficient.
because I'm a junior.
I think that's actually a section that doesn't overlap with any of the early ones, but I'd really like to know a little bit more. So if anyone had just 2 LRs and that was one of them, let us know, because I think that's its own section.
So I'm particularly invested in this. I think I think every one of those questions goes in a section we already talked about. But we'll see.
This is the kind of conversation we have at the end where we're like, do we even talk about this? Yeah. And I was like, let's actually mention it, because I know there's some 2LR people out there. I want to get a little bit more information. This also goes back to what you and I said before, which is that information affects the quality of the information that goes out. And there are, especially with multiple LR people, 3LR, experimental, a lot of difficulty remembering. And I completely sympathize with that. It just makes it really challenging for us. Yeah. I will say, though, Jon, and this I think will maybe relieve some people, there was an LR section out there that I think was harder than all the others. And purportedly, and certainly from what we've heard, had several questions that were in what people call like a mini logic game style. I tend to think they're probably more formal logic than anything.
Yeah, me too.
From what I've seen. But there were several questions in this section. I saw a lot of 3LR people come in on Saturday in particular who were worried about that. That section was experimental as far as we can tell. So I think that's the good news on that. Anything to add there?
No. I do hope people give us a little feedback. I also hope people realize that you and I tend to settle these debates with knives. With fisticuffs sometimes, but knives if they're handy. So one of us will bleed. That's a joke. No, we talk it out.
No shit, it's a joke.
Yeah, no shit. That's why you still have lips.
Especially since we live several hundred miles apart.
Oh no, I was going to say close enough to cut you.
Let's use your words, Jon. Use your words to cut me. All right, let's get to the scoring matrix. It is late here. Dude, I think both you and I are feeling it. It's been, I think we're getting almost, we're spiraling.
Yeah, that's my feeling.
All right, let's talk about the matrix and what that means for us. This is the scoring scale prediction. This is probably what a lot of people have been like, finally, they've gotten to this. Sorry, it's one of those nights. This is what we're trying to predict. How many questions you can miss to get a 170 for these various scoring scales. Each of these section combinations, and it's going to be 1 RC and 2 LR, is going to add up to a certain number. It might be 7, 8, 9, what have you. And so we're going to go through each of the sections, and what you need to do is listen for your RC and then see how that affects your scale, and then listen for your 2 LR and see how those two together affect your LR. Now, it's not just kind of random. We're going to start by saying that the average scale here is that you can miss 7 to get 170. So you can miss 7. So you start off at this -7 one. If a section loosens it up and it was a harder section, you'll go to say 8, for example. One of the things I always remind everybody is we are conservative here. If we're not sure and we're on the line, we will go for the more conservative estimate, which is usually the tighter scaling, because that produces fewer surprises on test day. This does apply to the new scoring scale, though, that affects the 1 RC, 2 LR format. So in the past, if you took an LSAT prior to August, we started at -7. We still do, because even though they added 2 questions to these tests on average, they didn't change the 170 scoring scale mark.
Which is rough.
Are we ready?
This is also going to encompass the international and domestic tests. So regardless of where you tested, this should include you.
-7. Let's start with the first passage we talked about. Vera Brittain, the enrichment courts, the Keystone Predators. Jon, you and I have had a lot of debates over this one before. And in the past, we've talked about it perhaps not moving the scale. And I think both you and I really think that it's what we call 0.5.
Yeah.
meaning that at the 170 level, it's not going to change your scale from 7. But if you're, say, scoring 150s or 160s, it gives you an extra question, especially that last passage there. So it doesn't affect a 170 score, but it does affect scores lower than 170. Yeah. So you'd be at 0.5 there.
I'm going to put a slight point to that, if you don't mind, which is when we do these half point estimates, what we're really saying is that people at a high score level tend to do better on things that are difficult than people at a lower score level. So the impact is going to be felt differently. We used to play with this a lot with games where a hard game was going to hurt people at a 155 or 160 or 162 differently than it was going to hurt people at, say, 173. Yep. Same thing applies to reading comp. Same thing applies to logical reasoning. It's a bit more nuanced and nebulous, but that's what we're really trying to gauge here, is where this is going to have an effect. That's what we mean.
At the 170 level, the expectation is you're getting most of these things right. Yeah. So there's not as much latitude up there. And sometimes people ask us, well, all right, predicted at 170, 160, 150. We can't do that. High levels of difficulty are much easier for us to see in these questions than, say, the mid-level difficulties where 150 and 160 have more problems. So
I'm glad you made that point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. It's simply a function of the way, the scoring scales work, honestly. Mm-hmm. All right. So that Keystone Predators is 0.5. So you go from 7 to 7.5. And then you'd have to think, where am I on the scale? Am I a 170 score? Well, I still only can miss 7. If you're a lower score than that, then you'd have an extra question you could have missed in there because of that. Let's go to the next RC, which was the nature philosophy and the German psychology. Our friend Rakim and the lyrical properties, action video games, and neuroimaging in court. Sorry, but our estimation of this is that it's not going to move the scale one way or the other. I think from what I've heard from a lot of people and what we've seen from the people that we know that took this test, again, all RC is hard. This was more on the easier side as opposed to really high levels of difficulty.
Okay, I agree.
Let's go to the next one. This was the architecture education, the Malthus passage, brand values, and the Patricia Cowing space motion sickness. This also is not going to have any impact on the scaling. And now we come to 2 passages. Obviously, no one had 2 passages that were scored, but if you had one of these, it is going to move the scale. The first one is that Mayan civilization collapse, the GMOs, the Beckett being strict, and the intellectual property law revolving around copyrights and economics. We have talked about this in the past, and in doing so, we said that this moved the scale by 1. So if you were at 7, you'd go to 8. Yeah. This is also the same for the last of the 5 passages we're going to mention, which covered Galileo's mistake about Dante's Inferno, uncivil disobedience and civil disobedience, privatization of water use, and the Mexican photographer Graciela Iturbide. There you go. Said it again.
Twist the
Not
knife,
as well as the first time. Twist it.
Beautiful.
It's a good one to say, although that
is. Just for
her last name is more of a challenge that time for me. This will also move the scale by 1. I love the Spanish language, so I love saying words like that. That one I need to practice on.
It did it well.
That name's a tough one. Iturbide.
But you and I are actually in agreement on pretty much every one of the estimations here in terms of scoring impact. I think Iturbide is probably going to be a -1 loosening. Ditto with the Mayan collapse, the GMOs. So yeah, I'm with you, man.
So essentially everybody here is either at 7, 7.5, or 8. Yep. And again, the 7.5 is part of the nuance that we've explained. So there's a real range of outcome here on RC, and we've been seeing a lot of that. Let's go into LR. Let's focus on the first 4 passages, and then I'll even throw in an estimation of that other one, depending upon how things work out. Let's go with the first one, which was Aristotle, salt mineral licks, tomatoes as a fruit, and Nile crocodiles. We've talked about this in the past and said that it does not move the scale, so that would keep you where you're at. Then we'll go to the hair pigment one with Orwell, the Egyptian dice, and the cougars eating those big horn sheep, those poor sheep. We've talked about this one before, and it is 0.5. Yeah. So again, doesn't cut you a break at 170, does cut you a break if you are downscale. Now, if you had the Vera Brittain Keystone Predators RC, and then you added this, particular one, those 2 halves would add up to 1. So you would then move to 8 at that point. All right. So again, just keep adding it up. You got 2 LRs, so make sure you get both of them. Let's go to the next LR1, and really the remainder are all going to be zeroed. This was the one about money to build electric cars, the food trucks, and the blood glucose and memory. No effect. We talked about that one before, and it stays. Then we had the ancient charcoal writing in caves, caffeine and coffee grounds versus tea, the salmon and the pesticide insecticide, and the cereal brand executives with the wonderful jobs. Also 0. And even that beer and barley, bike locks, dark matter, Jon, and so forth, I think if that is a separate section, it's also going to be 0. We'll probably figure that out here in the next couple of days as people start to realize, oh, wait, I didn't give enough information, I'll give more. But most of the LR I thought was very fair on this test. Obviously, the one about the hair pigment and Orwell and the Egyptian dice seemed to be a little bit on the harder side, and we've already talked about that in the past in more detail, so we just used the analysis we had before. That doesn't appear that they changed any questions. Yeah. So,
and ditto, for what it's worth, and it might be worth a lot, questions that appeared in sections that we don't think are scored in LR. Again, I hesitate to mention experimental questions in LR because we tend to avoid them. I don't really want to do that. But if you're hearing things, you're like, I definitely had that. I definitely had Orwell. I definitely had elephants being selectively bred or whatever, domesticated. And you had a third LR. That third LR, you can actually discount. You can ignore it. And I know that weighs heavy on people's minds, but the idea that they're like, man, I had 3 questions that were these logical constructs that I'd never seen before, formal logic or deep, heavy conditional reasoning. If that's in an experimental section, you can actually just forget it ever happened to you.
These questions are coming. We're seeing them in scored sections, and here you're seeing them in experimental sections. They're coming.
Yeah.
We predicted it. We talked about it in the last Crystal Ball. You put up a specific problem set that revolved around these types of questions because we know that it is. And the reason we know is that experimental sections for the last year have featured a heavier than normal use of kind of like hard conditional, hard formal logic, even some hard numerical questions. Yeah. So nothing that they haven't done in the past, but it just seems like they'd ignored them for a while, and now they're making a comeback.
Yeah. Well, Dave, notice where the content just came from. What are we looking at here? We're looking at a bunch of reuses, aside from the Rap and Rakim and the action video game set. Everything that we saw, whether it's reading comp or logical reasoning, came from a test that had been used before, which is to say that had been on a test with logic games. So if they're going to try to replace logic games with some sort of conceptual idea, you wouldn't have seen it yet. They didn't need to, but you're going to see it in the future. That's what the experimental sections do. That's what the future of this test is. So that's basically what we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's the new sections, the prior experimental sections that are starting to show this. Notice that if you look at your scaling there, it's basically for everybody somewhere between 7 and 8.5, depending upon your very specific combination of 1 RC and 2 LR. So hopefully you took our advice that we give in all the crystal balls and even on every podcast. Take notes when you take your LSAT. When you finish up your exam, don't immediately start drinking a beer or, listening to, some album. Immediately sit down and say, all right, this is my order. This is what I had in each section, because then you can come back here to something like this and be like, all right, now I know what I should be thinking about this, as well as, wow, that hard section of RC or that hard section of LR that I hated, it wasn't scored, because that's normally what's been happening is we've seen some difficult things that didn't get counted, and that's always the way it is. Regardless, it will all shake itself out on Wednesday, October 23rd at 9 a.m. in the morning, because that is when LSAT scores for this test are released.
Yep. The hypocrisy of not going immediately to a bar. From you or I. Drink a beer, whatever you said.
You can go 5 minutes after. I don't care. Just sit down and take some notes on your test so that you can figure it out later on and not have to rack your brain. I've had some students who've been very upset with themselves like a day later, like,
I have too.
Hey, I've just discovered I can figure this out. I'm like, but we need information. I need to know. I don't remember anything. I'm like, yeah, do you realize how many different combinations of tests are out there? Mm-hmm. Dozens. I don't know which one you had, so I can't help you with your scoring scale or what, more importantly, was experimental.
Yeah, I'm not calling you a hypocrite. I'm saying if I were to give that advice.
Yeah, well, I mean.
But no, I did. I've talked to students through the past several days who were like, man, I wish I'd written that down, or I wish I'd had a better recall of this. I'm like, man, We told you.
Every time. Comes up every single time. You and I both have students who say that. So we may harp on it, but it's because I'm trying to help people help themselves.
Yeah, exactly right.
And when you help yourself, then I can help you better. And the same thing for you, Jon. Normally, I would ask you, Jon, if you have any final comments, but I think you've said plenty tonight, so I'm just going to go right to the outro.
Bye.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, and I can't imagine you didn't, leave a comment or rating as well. And please send us any questions that you have to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com, whether it's about the test content, whether it's about admissions or about anything. We're happy to help. Hopefully this podcast was useful. We'll all find out on October 23rd how things played out. Please let us know. In the meantime, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.